Picture a bustling airport terminal just before mid-morning, the air thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the echo of rolling suitcases on polished tile. At gate 42, 16-year-old Monique Davis stands quietly just 10 feet from the neatly roped-off first-class line. She wears a worn denim jacket, faded blue jeans, and scuffed white sneakers, her slender frame almost lost among the business travelers in crisp suits and designer luggage. Monique clutches her backpack straps as her big dark eyes scan the departure board, heart fluttering with nerves. She's simply trying to catch her flight home. Just then, the polished shoe click of a flight attendant's heels cuts through the ambient hum. Colleen Briggs, 28, strides toward Monique with the sharp efficiency of someone used to giving orders. Her navy uniform is impeccable, her badge gleaming beneath the airport lights. Colleen's lips curve into a thin smile that never reaches her eyes. She thinks she can read Monique's place and the world at a glance, and she's about to prove it. "Hey you!" Colleen snaps, her voice amplified so everyone within a 20-foot radius can hear. Conversations die, phones pause mid-screed. Monique freezes. The attendant thrusts a clipboard under her chin. "This area is for first class only. Economy seats are back there." She jerks her head toward an indistinct cluster of travelers at the end of the line. Her tone leaves no room for misunderstanding. Monique does not belong here. Monique's cheeks burn. She isn't blocking anyone. She's standing well behind the rope, waiting patiently. She opens her mouth to speak, but the words stick in her throat. Colleen folds her arms, leans in, and barks, "Show me your ticket or I'll have security haul you out." The clipboard rattles in her hand like a weapon. Nearby passengers shuffle uncomfortably. Not one person steps forward. The silence is almost as cruel as Colleen's words. Inside, Monique's throat tightens. She pictures her grandmother's warm kitchen, telling her that dignity is everything. Tears sting her eyes, but she forces herself to stay calm. Every stare from the crowd feels like 1,000 needles, yet she does nothing. They see her as disposable. It's that quiet cruelty that hurts the most. She squeezes her eyes shut for a moment, willing herself to breathe. Instead of a ticket, Monique pulls a small flip phone from her pocket. Her fingers shake as she dials, a deliberate act that even Colleen doesn't anticipate. On the first ring, people glance up. On the second ring, they whisper. On the third ring, a calm, male voice answers. "It's happening again." Monique's voice is barely above a whisper. "It's happening again." Then she hangs up. No drama, no shouting, just one quiet call. Colleen's smirk widens. She thinks she's won. She tosses her clipboard aside, allows herself a small nod of satisfaction. Monique stands motionless, and for a moment the attendant believes the scene is over. But 10 floors above, in a glass-walled office overlooking the concourse, Douglas Reeves, head of security operations, is watching a live feed on his monitor. His brow furrows as he sees the shaming replayed thousands of times on social media. Douglas paces back and forth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He slams his fist on the desk. "Who authorized this?" he demands into his headset. Comments flood the screen. Outrage, calls for boycott, tags of news outlets. A younger colleague points at the ticker showing share prices dipping by the minute. Douglas's knuckles turn white. This is no minor incident. This runs deeper than a single mistreatment. It's a full-blown public crisis. Back at gate 42, 2 men in black suits and a stern woman in a gray pantsuit force their way through the crowd. She's Camilla Rhodes, Vice President of Customer Experience, and she's had just about enough. She approaches Monique and places a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Miss Davis, are you all right?" Monique nods, too stunned to speak. Camilla turns to Colleen. "Step aside, please," she says firmly. Colleen's face drains of color as security officers materialize at her side. Camilla raises her voice so the entire gate area can hear. "There has been a misunderstanding. We apologize deeply for any distress." Every word is measured, every syllable clear as crystal. The atmosphere shifts. Passengers who once watched in silent approval now lower their eyes. Colleen is escorted away, her uniform disheveled, her dignity stripped bare. No one defends her. The crowd that ignored Monique's pain now watches her with a newfound respect. Soon Monique is led to a small room behind the boarding area, where a kind woman from passenger relations offers her water. Monique takes a slow sip, her hand still trembling. Tears finally spill as she realizes her call set something unstoppable in motion. She isn't comforted yet, but she knows she's not invisible anymore. Meanwhile, somewhere off-site, Leonard Walsh, a part owner of the airline, sees the video and orders an emergency trigger. Flights are grounded, operations are halted, executives start canceling meetings. Within hours, the airline's stock has fallen by double digits. Headlines flash, major carrier devastated by discrimination scandal, and black teens stranded at airports around the country stare at blank departure boards. By dusk, the once proud airline is in crisis talks, CEOs scrambling to contain the fallout. Monique's single phone call, the one soft, resolute whisper, has shattered an empire built on indifference. In a world that treats perception as truth, her dignity forced the corporation to finally reckon with its own cruelty. And at day's end, as Monique boards a relief flight escorted by Camilla herself, you can almost see the shift in the air. Monique Davis steps onto the plane with her head held high. She taught an entire industry that respect is non-negotiable. For every viewer, especially those of us who have raised daughters and grandchildren, it's a powerful reminder. Justice can rise from the quietest voice, and sometimes the sweetest revenge is watching the unjust tremble when faced with truth. Monique Davis sat on the edge of the soft leather couch, her hands still folded in her lap, as she watched the busy terminal through the floor-to-ceiling window. Every few seconds she heard the distant roar of engines or the squeal of tires on concrete, but the chaos brewing inside those walls was far louder. Gate agents had gone from polite smiles to urgent whispers, and overhead announcements shifted from boarding now to vague apologies about delays due to unforeseen circumstances. Nobody offered an explanation, but Monique knew exactly why the air felt so heavy. Camilla Rhodes hovered behind her, phone pressed to her ear, her brow furrowed with worry. Monique could hear fragments of Camilla's hushed conversation, words like containment plan and emergency measures. And it occurred to her that the airline's hidden skeletons were finally rattling free of the closet. She took a slow breath, her hoodie feeling suddenly heavier as she prepared herself for whatever came next. The door clicked open, and Garrett Moore stepped inside, looking every bit the part of a man who had just sprinted down a hallway. His black suit was impeccable, but his expression was strained, eyes flicking between Monique and the executives clustered behind him. He carried a leather binder so thick it suggested years of policies and procedures, yet his posture folded under the weight of real crisis. "Miss Davis," he began, his voice attempting calm even though his hands trembled as he set the binder on the coffee table. "On behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for everything you endured." He offered a small, stiff bow. Monique simply leaned back, arms uncrossed but motionless, letting his words hang in the air like unwanted confetti. He glanced down at his notes. "We'd like to move you to a private suite," he said, voice low, "a quieter environment while we resolve these issues." Monique looked at him evenly. She didn't need more quiet environments or private suites. She needed accountability and action. She stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder, her gaze unwavering. "I'll wait right here," she said softly. "Thank you." Without another word, she turned and faced the airport once more, as if daring them to make the next move. Behind closed doors, the real storm raged. At the administrative wing, phones rang off the hook. Brian Holt, the airline's CEO, whose office usually glowed with mahogany panels and muted gold accents, seemed about to rip them off the walls in frustration. "I want names," he barked, slamming his hand on the table so hard the legal pads fluttered like wounded birds. "Every executive who knew and stayed silent. Every manager who ignored a complaint. I want a full risk assessment now." Peter Collins, the head of public affairs, stuttered as he shifted his weight through that tension. "Brian, there's something you should know about Miss Davis," he said. Brian's eyes narrowed. "Then say it." Peter swallowed. "She's the granddaughter of Eleanor Davis." The room froze on those words. Eleanor Davis was a name spoken in reverent whispers, a founder whose family still held a controlling stake through shell companies and trusts. This was no viral scandal to be spin-controlled. This was personal, to the woman who built the company from the ground up. Up in the private suite's hallway, Monique noticed the staff giving her space now, not afraid of her, but of what she represented. Some lowered their eyes, others stole glances filled with regret or fear. She walked down the short corridor and paused at the door marked Executive Lounge, feeling the irony that she was being sheltered by the very people who had tried to humiliate her. When she entered, Camilla Rhodes stepped forward, looking as though she had aged 10 years in the past hour. Russell Denton, Vice President of Legal Affairs, stood at the far end beside Monica Reyes, the communications chief. His gray suit was crumpled at the sleeves, and his normally neat hair was in disarray from relentless meetings. Monica clutched a tablet so tightly her knuckles were white. They both forced polite smiles that failed under the strain of accusations flooding social media. Russell cleared his throat. "Miss Davis, we extend our deepest apologies. This does not reflect our values." His voice cracked on the final words. Monique looked at him, her steady gaze far colder than any words he could muster. She rose from the couch, reaching for a small table lamp as if to cast a spotlight on her calm defiance. "So you can offer free flights and vouchers?" she said, voice quiet but firm. "Do you think that fixes it?" The room grew silent, thick with shame. A knock sounded at the door before anyone could reply. A young assistant poked his head in, shaking a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, handing it to Russell. On the screen scrolled live headlines: "After railing charged incident. Board members shares dumped. Emergency shareholder meeting called." The stock ticker at the bottom showed a free fall. 20% down and still sliding. Russell's face went pale. Monica gasped, stepping back as if struck. Camilla covered her mouth with her hand. Monique watched them, feeling a measure of satisfaction settle in her chest. All those executives who once ignored her pain now saw the real cost of their indifference. She folded her arms and addressed the room. "You had years to make this right," she said quietly. "Every complaint you buried, every apology you withheld, every time you looked the other way, you took the easy path and protected yourselves." Tears sprang to Russell's eyes. "Miss Davis, we are ready to negotiate any compensation you require," he pleaded. Monique shook her head. "This isn't about money," she said. "It's about respect." She turned toward the window, where a plane sat idle on the tarmac, its engine silent. "You let your pride blind you," she continued, "and you almost destroyed everything your founder built just to hide a truth no one wanted to admit." Outside the suite, staff members crowded around monitors showing emergency press conferences, union leaders demanding accountability, and social media influencers condemning the airline. In the control tower, air traffic controllers watched in stunned silence as flights were grounded one by one. Families waiting for loved ones had no idea that their tickets were now worthless, that loyalty points and platinum memberships meant nothing in the face of corporate collapse. Finally, 5 of the flights were groomed with a different name, and the last flight was the latest. Inside the lounge, Monica Reyes cleared her throat. "We will do whatever it takes to rebuild trust," she said. We'll reorganize leadership, launch a comprehensive bias training program, and ensure zero tolerance going forward." Monique nodded once, her expression softening. "That's a start," she said, "but real change requires more than slogans." She met Camilla's eyes. "It requires action." Leonard Walsh, the part owner who had watched from his glass tower, rubbed his temples as he prepared to call in every favor he had. He had pulled funding, shelved merger talks, and leaked internal audits. Now he watched his empire crumble under the weight of truth. He picked up his phone and said, "Prepare the final directive." On the other end was someone who answered with a single word, "Yes, ma'am." Back in the suite, Monique collected her backpack. She had no desire to relish this moment of vindication. She only wanted the world to know that a girl in a hoodie was more powerful than an empire built on indifference. As she walked toward the door, Camilla fell into step beside her. "Monique, thank you," she whispered. "You did the right thing." Monique's shoulders lifted in a small, proud smile. "Sometimes a single voice can shake the ground," she said, "but it takes courage to make it heard." She stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind the executives scrambling to contain the fallout. Every echo of her footsteps reminded them that respect is earned, not granted. And somewhere beyond the gates, passengers finally learned why their flights had stalled and why their loyalty points would never matter again. They learned that Monique Davis had spoken up, and that her quiet call had toppled giants. Monique Davis remained seated on the plush leather couch, her fingers still tracing the worn stitching of her backpack. Around her, the executive suite felt suddenly claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves were closing in on every person inside. Russell Denton had just dropped the tablet into his lap, and on its screen blazed the headline that shattered any remaining illusion of control. Leaked documents revealed the airline's long history of hidden discrimination complaints, and a federal investigation into hiring practices was already underway. Major shareholders were pulling out support by the minute. Monique lifted her head and watched the faces around her. The color drained from Russell's cheeks, the tight twitch of Monica Reyes's lips, the way Camilla Rhodes's shoulders slumped ever so slightly. None of them dared to meet her eyes. Monica bent closer to the tablet as Garrett Moore hovered at the edge of the room, uncertainty plastered across his features. She pressed her hand against her mouth, eyes wide with horror, as memos scrolled by showing that Brielle's humiliation wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systemic pattern, a culture of looking away. Each memo described another young traveler, another suppressed complaint, another manager who chose to preserve the airline's image rather than protect a passenger. Monique swallowed and reminded herself to breathe. The girl in the hoodie who dared to make one quiet call had set a chain reaction that now threatened to bring down an empire. Leonard Walsh, part owner of the company and long accustomed to pulling financial levers with a single phone call, sat calmly in a sleek conference room across town, surrounded by a dozen furious shareholders. The storm in that mahogany-paneled room was deafening. Phones buzzing incessantly, lawyers shoving thick folders across tables, demands for immediate resignation and legal threats piled high. Some shouted about class action lawsuits. Others screamed that their stock options were now worthless. But Leonard merely steepled his fingers, watching the chaos with detached interest. When he finally leaned forward and announced that funding would be withdrawn, merger talks terminated and internal audits leaked if necessary, he delivered it with the same measured voice people used when ordering coffee. The shareholders froze. Then they erupted again, this time in stunned silence that spoke louder than any roar. Back at the airport, announcements crackled awkwardly through the PA system. "Attention all passengers, Flight 317 to Boston is canceled. Flight 220 to Chicago is canceled. We apologize for the inconvenience." Every second screen around the terminal began to blink red. Canceled, canceled, canceled. In the bustling concourse, Janice Monroe clutched her handbag, her knuckles white against the leather as she stared at the melting grid of departure times. She turned to her companion, Grant Peters, normally composed but now pale and gripping his phone with such force his knuckles were chalk white. Janice's voice trembled. "They're falling apart right in front of us." Grant scarcely nodded. He could only stare at his screen as more flights vanished into nothingness. At gate 42, Mona Davis rose and stepped toward the window, her reflection backlit by the gray afternoon sky. She observed the planes taxiing slowly in the distance, oblivious to the disaster unfolding inside. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply waited. The walls of the executive suite grew colder by the minute. Each notification ping tightening the tension around everyone's heart. Russell Denton rubbed his forehead as if to massage away the headache pounding there. Monica Reyes tapped frenetically on her tablet, each scroll revealing another damning news report. Garrett Moore hovered near the door, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Camilla Rhodes stood by the window, arms crossed as she watched the pattern of jets glide across the tarmac, innocent of the chaos they represent. Then the door swung open again, and a man in a dark suit with a metal badge clipped to his belt stepped inside. His name tag read Federal Aviation Investigator, Martin Blake. The room shrank as he entered. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Martin strode past the executives without a word and handed a thin leather folder to Russell. Russell's hand quivered as he pried it open. Inside lay a formal notice, an immediate suspension of certain operating licenses, a demand for full access to staff records, internal communications, passenger complaint files, and hiring documents. Failure to comply would ground every plane bearing the airline's name within 24 hours. The words carved themselves into the faces of everyone present. Russell staggered back as if hit, collapsing into a chair so hard the leather squeaked. Monica gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Camilla closed her eyes, shoulders sagging as the full weight of the notice registered. Garrett Moore sank into the nearest armchair, burying his face in his hands. Martin Blake looked around the suite, his expression cold and unwavering. He cleared his throat. "You can either cooperate now," he said evenly, "or you can prepare to watch your entire fleet locked down within the next 24 hours. His voice was calm but carried a warning sharper than broken glass. Not a sound followed. The airline's walls were already cracking from within, and no one here could stop the collapse. Meanwhile, across the terminal, passengers sensed the shift. Customer service lines snaked interminably toward the ceiling as enraged travelers clamored for answers. A mother clutched a sobbing toddler as screens alternated between blinking red and apologetic messages. Rumors of a complete shutdown spread like wildfire. Some airline employees, unable to bear the shame, slipped off their name tags and melted into the throng of stranded travelers, hoping anonymity would shield them from the fallout. Grant Peters paced near a cafe window, phone glued to his ear as a travel agent's voice tried to soothe him with empty assurances of rebooking. Janice Monroe huddled with a small group, plotting a bus rental to reach Chicago or Boston, whichever destination could still be salvaged. Fear hung heavier than any packed suitcase. Inside the suite, Russell finally found his voice, or at least attempted to. He cleared his throat and turned to Monique. "We can fix this," he stammered. "We need only release a statement, suspend the employee involved, commit to diversity training, reach out to advocacy groups, pledge zero tolerance." His voice rose with each suggestion, desperation creeping in. Before he could finish, Martin Blake raised a hand, palm outward. A single motion silenced Russell more effectively than any shout. "You don't understand," Martin said flatly. "You're too late. This isn't about one bad apple. It's about the orchard you cultivated, the culture you protected, and the complaints you buried. You didn't fix it when you could. Now you'll watch it collapse." He turned and walked out, leaving the executives clutching empty air. Monica Reyes paced the perimeter of the suite, her bare feet muted by the thick carpet as she bit her thumbnail until she drew blood. Garrett Moore sat with his head in his hands, rocking slightly. Camilla Rhodes remained near the window, reflection blurred by tears she refused to let fall. Only Monique sat calmly on the couch, her posture straight, her gaze steady. She had ignited this ruin with a whisper, and now she watched its end with a serene sense of justice. This was not gloating. It was a quiet reckoning. Every person stranded beyond those doors had a story, and now those stories would be heard. Across town, Leonard Walsh made one final call. "Liquidate the remaining shares," he said simply. No further explanation needed. On the other end, someone replied, "Understood." The message was clear. The airline would not survive beyond tonight. Leonard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and watched a wall of monitors showing rolling news coverage. In one window, crowds paced the terminal. In another, lawyers slapped cease and desist orders on desks. In another, union leaders demanded immediate investigations. All of it moved too fast to stop. At the airport, the mood had shifted from confusion to rage. Passengers crowded the desks, voices rising in anger with every unanswered question. Children wailed. Elderly travelers slumped into chairs, heads in hands, defeated. The departure screens displayed a horror show of cancellations, so extensive that entire terminals lay dormant. Boarding gates stood empty and silent. Conveyors lay still. Security checkpoints, once teeming with people, felt abandoned as officers directed travelers to service desks for further instructions. Those two little words offered nothing but dread. Inside the executive suite, the final blow arrived when another assistant burst in, breathing hard. He handed a printed notice to Martin Blake, who glanced at it before passing it to Russell. Russell's entire frame shook as he read the Department of Transportation's final directive. Effective immediately, all operating certificates were suspended, pending investigation. All aircraft were ordered to return to base. All flights grounded, not just some flights, every single one. An announcement crackled through the speakers. "Attention passengers. Effective immediately, all flights with Crestline Airways have been suspended. Please proceed to service desks for further instructions." Grant Peters froze mid-step, phone slipping from his hand. Around him, travelers shouted in disbelief, some demanding refunds, others demanding answers. "What do we do?" she cried. The staffer shook his head, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry, ma'am, they're shutting everything down. The airline's finished." In the suite, Monica collapsed into a chair, face pressed against her hands. Garrett Moore remained slumped, silent, as if the ground beneath his feet had become quicksand. Russell rose unsteadily and approached Monique, who still sat motionless on the couch. He cleared his throat, voice cracking. "Ms. Davis," he said, "is there anything we can do to fix this?" Monique looked up, her dark eyes steady and unwavering. She rose and stood so close to Russell that he could feel the cool air around her. "You could have fixed it a long time ago," she said softly. "But you didn't think it mattered. Until today." Her words landed like a verdict, final and irrevocable. Russell flinched, as if struck. Monica recoiled. Camilla sank into a chair, her world unraveling. Garrett folded forward, face in his hands. Martin Blake leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his badge glinting under the harsh lights. He was not there to save them. He was there to witness the end. Monique squared her shoulders, looking at each of them in turn. "You let your pride blind you," she said, voice quiet but resonant. "You thought you could protect yourselves by silencing the truth. Now, all the walls you built to keep things hidden have come crashing down." Outside the suite, a hush fell over the immediate area as staff and passengers alike realized the full scope of what had happened. Stranded travelers stopped in their tracks, gripping carry-on bags as they processed the reality. Their trips were over. Vacation plans evaporated, business meetings missed, lives disrupted. The price of corporate arrogance had become their burden. Janice Monroe, standing near the service desk, wiped tears from her cheeks as she dialed a friend in Boston. Grant Peters slumped against a counter, phone glued to his ear as he tried to salvage any semblance of travel. But there was no salvage. Inside the conference room across town, Leonard Walsh rose from his seat. The shareholder meeting had dissolved into furious accusations and cries of betrayal. Some investors left the room in angry tears, others slammed doors as they departed. Leonard's final act was to pick up his briefcase, place it on the desk, and walk out without a backward glance. The empire he had helped build lay in ruins, but in that silence he felt no regret, only the cold satisfaction that truth had been served. At gate 42, Monique Davis collected her backpack and stepped toward the exit. Camilla Rhodes rose to follow her, hesitating for a moment. She caught Monique's eye and whispered, "Thank you." Monique managed a small, bittersweet smile. "It was the right thing to do," she said. "Someone had to speak up." Together they walked out of the locked suite, where dozens of stranded travelers looked on in awe and gratitude. In that moment, Monique understood that real justice often emerged from the quietest voices. As Monique passed through the terminal, the crowd parted like a wave. Some passengers mouthed, "Thank you." Others reached out to touch her arm, tears in their eyes. For many, Monique's courage had given them permission to question how they let cruelty go unseen for so long. She felt a warmth in her chest. Not comfort, but purpose. She had ignited a reckoning that no apology, no voucher, no public relations stunt could ever extinguish. In the concourse, screens now displayed helpline numbers for affected passengers and messages acknowledging systemic bias with a promise of real reform. Union representatives set up booths for legal aid. Groups of passengers formed informal support circles. The airport, once an engine of efficiency, had transformed into a place of reconciliation and solidarity. The roar of jet engines outside sounded distant, as if awaiting the day when planes might fly again under a banner of genuine respect. Later that evening, the last of Crestline Airways' idle jets sat in silence on the tarmac, their lights dimmed. Monique stood at a gate where a temporary shuttle bus now waited to take passengers to nearby hotels. She watched the bus fill with weary travelers who had stories of missed weddings, funerals, reunions, and business deals. Monique helped one elderly woman board, then turned and walked away, her figure small against the vast terminal. The first wall of Crestline had fallen when she made that quiet call, the final collapse, that complete unraveling of an empire built on prejudice and secrecy had come because she refused to be invisible. She had wielded dignity like a weapon, and it had cut deeper than any lawsuit. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the roar of engines overhead sounded different now, an echo of possibilities yet to come, of an industry learning at last that respect is the foundation of service. For Monique Davis, the journey was far from over, but in that moment she knew she had changed the course of history, and that knowledge gave her the strength to keep walking forward. Monique Davis stepped out of the terminal into the pale glow of early morning, the air crisp against her cheeks. A taxi idled at the curb, its engine humming quietly. She climbed in without a word, her mind still turning over the day's events. The driver, sensing her pensive mood, kept the radio low, and she watched the airport lights fade behind her as the city woke up. By mid-morning, she found herself in a modest news studio, cameras trained on her every move. The anchor introduced her as the teenager whose quiet call had brought down one of the nation's largest airlines. Monique sat calmly on the edge of the chair, her faded denim jacket and worn sneakers a stark contrast to the polished set. When asked for her thoughts, she looked directly into the lens and said simply, "No one should ever feel invisible." That statement went viral. Within hours, opinion pieces praised her courage, social media lit up with messages of support, and hashtags like Monique Stand Tall trended nationwide. Grandmothers everywhere posted private messages to her, thanking her for standing up against cruelty. Monique's phone buzzed nonstop, but she ignored it. She had more important things on her mind than teen drama or fleeting fame. That afternoon, the airline's remaining executives faced a formal press conference in the same terminal where it had all started. Camilla Rhodes stood at the podium, her voice steady as she announced sweeping changes. An independent review board, mandatory bias training for every employee, and a commitment to a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. She paused and added, "We owe a debt of gratitude to Monique Davis for showing us what true dignity looks like." Later, Monique attended a congressional hearing on corporate accountability. She sat in the witness chair alongside lawyers and airline officials. When Senator Maria Thompson asked her what they could learn, Monique replied, "Listen first. Treat everyone with respect, no matter how small they seem." The room fell silent, and in that hush, she felt the weight of real change settling in. Back home in her grandmother's cozy living room, the soft scent of freshly brewed tea welcomed Monique. Her grandmother, Eleanor Davis, wrapped a warm shawl around her granddaughter's shoulders. "I've always known you had fire in you," she said, her voice thick with pride. Monique leaned her head against Eleanor's and whispered, "I just spoke up." In the weeks that followed, Crestline Airways filed for bankruptcy protection, its assets reorganized under a new name and leadership. Former employees who had witnessed wrongdoing were encouraged to come forward, and dozens of airline staff found work at carriers that pledged equity and respect. Training programs developed by civil rights groups were rolled out across the industry, and passenger rights became a top priority. Monique returned to school as heroine and advocate. She joined the student council and started a Speak Up club, teaching her peers that a single voice could spark profound change. At lunch tables, she sat with students of every background, offering a friendly smile and open ear. Teachers reported that bullying incidents dropped by nearly half, thanks in part to conversations Monique led on empathy and respect. News outlets followed her journey as she traveled to conferences, sharing the stage with CEOs and civil rights leaders. She spoke about the power of dignity, the necessity of speaking out, and the ripple effect one person can start. She never asked for applause. She simply told her story and let it stand on its own. One evening, Monique sat at her bedroom desk, pen in hand, writing letters to airline boards, Fortune 500 CEOs, and government regulators. She urged them to adopt transparency, to honor every passenger's humanity, and to remember that the smallest voice can echo the loudest when justice is at stake. She signed each letter with her name and a simple line, "Respect is everything." By the time she turned 17, Monique had been invited to the White House to participate in a youth advisory council on corporate ethics. There, she met other young leaders and saw firsthand how change could cross borders. Together, they drafted a charter urging companies worldwide to pledge anti-discrimination practices and open complaint channels with independent oversight. On the anniversary of Gate 42, Monique returned to the airport for a commemorative ceremony. A small plaque was unveiled near the gate, inscribed with her name and the words, "For courage, for dignity." Passengers paused to read it, some wiping tears from their eyes. Flight crews bowed their heads in silent salute as she laid a single white rose at its base. That evening, Monique walked out onto a balcony overlooking the runway. Jets taxied beneath a sunset streaked with orange and pink. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling a sense of closure. The terminal behind her had returned to normal hustle, but she knew it carried a new heartbeat, a promise that respect would never again be optional. Her story became part of school textbooks under the chapter, "When One Voice Sparks an Empire's Fall." Young students wrote essays about Monique Davis, describing how she transformed humiliation into reform, Libraries stocked her interviews, and teachers used her example to encourage kindness. For many, she symbolized the idea that dignity is a force more powerful than any corporation. Years later, Monique pursued a degree in social justice and corporate governance. She joined nonprofit boards and advised companies on ethical practices. Headlines still referred to her as the teen who toppled giants, but she preferred simply being called a catalyst for change. She insisted that the real victory belonged to every passenger who refused to look away when someone was shamed. In her speeches, she often recounted that moment at Gate 42. How a simple phone call, made with shaking hands, carried the power to undo years of hidden wrongs. She reminded audiences that courage isn't always loud and that sometimes the gentle voice wins the day. And she closed each talk with the same invitation: speak up wherever you are, because respect begins with each of us. Monique Davis's journey showed an entire industry that the wheels of justice could turn faster than any engine. She proved that age, attire, or status cannot silence the call for fairness. And in every airport terminal and boardroom that adopted new policies, her legacy lived on. A reminder that when dignity stands firm, even the mightiest walls will fall away. A month after the airline's collapse, Monique Davis found herself standing beneath a glittering chandelier in a grand hotel ballroom. The industry's biggest names had gathered for what they called a new era of air travel gala. It felt strange to return to the world that nearly destroyed her, but Monique agreed to speak because she believed change needed constant attention. As she gripped the microphone, she saw familiar faces in the crowd. Some offering grateful smiles, others wearing expressions she couldn't yet read. Before she could begin, a hush fell over the room. Colleen Briggs entered with deliberate steps, her navy uniform jacket replaced by a tailored suit that hung awkwardly on her slender frame. Every eye turned toward her as she strode onto the small stage beside Monique. Colleen's face was pale, her jaw set in a hard line. She held a stack of papers, shaking slightly as she prepared to address the gathered executives, union leaders, and press. Colleen cleared her throat and spoke in a voice that trembled with both anger and pain. "I lost everything because of one call," she began, her words echoing off the crystal walls. "My career, my reputation, my livelihood, all gone." She raised the papers. "I was taught to follow procedure, to protect passengers. I never set out to humiliate a child. Yet today I'm homeless, unemployed, and vilified." Her eyes locked on Monique's. "Do you understand what that's like?" The room crackled with tension. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with sympathetic horror as Colleen revealed payoff stubs, showing that dozens of flight attendants had already been let go, many with decades of service. She waved memos from the old airline, directives insisting that first-class boundaries be enforced at all costs or face reprimand. The cruelty of the system she'd served was undeniable, yet here she was, demanding empathy for a role in that same cruelty. Monique felt her heart clench. She remembered the fear in Colleen's eyes the day she placed that call at Gate 42. Yet she also recalled the shame she felt under Colleen's harsh glare. The audience sat frozen, caught between compassion for the fallen flight attendant and Monique's righteous indignation. Monique stepped forward, her voice gentle but resolute. "I'm sorry for the pain you've endured," she said, meeting Colleen's gaze. "I never wanted to ruin anyone's life. My call wasn't meant to destroy, only to demand respect." A single tear rolled down Monique's cheek as she continued. "You were part of a system that punished empathy. You enforced rules that left me feeling small and invisible. But I forgive you, because forgiveness is how we rebuild. I won't let anger turn into the same cruelty we're fighting." Her words hung in the air like a benediction. Some in the crowd nodded, others wiped their eyes. Even Colleen's lips trembled with unexpected relief. The gala's host, a celebrated airline CEO who'd lost his own job in the scandal, strode on stage and placed a hand on each woman's shoulder. "Tonight is about healing," he announced. "We will launch the Davis-Briggs Fellowship for Compassionate Service, offering paid training and support for displaced employees and passengers alike." Applause erupted, shaking the chandeliers. In that moment, Monique and Colleen stood side by side, bound by shared sorrow and a newfound purpose. Yet, Monique's journey wasn't free of guilt. In the days that followed, she visited families of laid-off workers, people who'd helped her on long flights or lent her a blanket when she was cold, only to learn they were struggling to pay rent or find new jobs. Each story cut deeper than the last. She organized a relief fund, raising thousands of dollars to cover groceries and rent assistance. When an elderly former flight attendant broke down in tears at her doorstep, calling Monique an angel, Monique felt both joy and unbearable sorrow. Late at night in her own bedroom, Monique sometimes woke with her heart pounding, reliving the moment Colleen screamed at her in 500-foot echoes of shame. She'd fight for justice by day, but by night the memory haunted her like a storm cloud. Her grandmother, Eleanor Davis, found her once staring out the window at the moonlit runway. "You carry too much weight," Eleanor said softly, wrapping a blanket around her granddaughter. "You did what was right. Now let the world bear the cost of its own cruelty." Comforted by her grandmother's words, Monique channeled the pain into new activism. She penned op-eds calling for federal legislation to protect passengers from abusive treatment, proposing that airlines be required to install real-time complaint hotlines monitored by independent ombudsmen. She met with representatives on Capitol Hill, her calm demeanor and unshakable conviction swaying skeptics on both sides of the aisle. At hearings, she described how being humiliated at Gate 42 had felt like the weight of 1,000 judgments pressing against my chest. Lawmakers nodded, visibly moved by her testimony. Meanwhile, small victories began to appear industry-wide. Airlines nationwide adopted third-party audit systems, triggered whenever a passenger complaint reached a certain threshold. Union contracts guaranteed fair treatment for both staff and customers. Travel websites added respect score metrics based on aggregated user reviews. Passengers posted selfies with the hashtag #RespectInFlight to celebrate airlines that honored dignity. Monique watched these changes with cautious hope, knowing that real progress required constant vigilance. The emotional climax came when Monique was invited to speak at an international aviation summit held in Chicago's sprawling convention center. Thousands of delegates filled the hall, from cabin crew veterans to government regulators. As she approached the podium, Monique spotted Colleen in the front row, now a fellow advocate, her eyes shining with pride. Monique steadied herself, then shared a moment of vulnerability few had seen. "There were nights," she confessed, voice thick with feeling, "when I thought I'd broken the world by speaking up. I feared that my little voice would be drowned by corporate power, but I learned that every act of compassion creates ripples. When we choose empathy over indifference, we build bridges instead of walls." She paused, scanning the audience. "I still carry fear. Fear of forgetting that our strength lies in kindness, not revenge. But each of you carries that same fear. So let us promise to stand guard over each other's dignity. Always." The hall erupted in a standing ovation that felt like the world itself was exhaling. Tears streamed down Monique's cheeks as she nodded to Colleen and the audience. In that electrifying moment, she understood that her journey was never about destroying an airline, but about constructing a new legacy of respect that would outlast any corporation. As delegates filed out, many approached Monique with heartfelt thanks. Flight attendants recounted how they'd volunteered for training workshops. CEOs pledged to fund national dignity and travel scholarships. Even former managers, once silent overseers of cruelty, apologized and committed to change. Monique embraced each person with warmth, her heart swelling with empathy for their shared humanity. Later that evening, Monique stood on a balcony overlooking Lake Michigan's calm waters. The city lights danced on the surface, and the gentle hum of traffic felt like a lullaby. She breathed deeply, feeling the full weight of her journey, its sharp edges and soft moments, and the promise of what lay ahead. Though the path forward remained uncertain, Monique Davis knew that the most powerful force in the world was a single voice rising in defense of another's dignity. And as long as that voice kept speaking, no system, no injustice could ever silence the truth. Monique Davis leaned into Eleanor Davis's words, the warmth of her grandmother's office wrapping around her like a protective blanket. She had expected triumph to feel like fireworks, but instead it felt like the slow exhale of a breath held too long. She pressed her fingertips to the scars on her knuckles, each one a reminder of battles she had fought simply by living her life. Eleanor set aside her cane and reached into a drawer for 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea. She handed one to Monique, the fragrant steam curling into the air between them. Monique lifted the mug to her lips and let the warmth seep into her hands. It grounded her. It reminded her that she was still just a teenager, someone with homework, friends, and things she loved like painting and that old guitar in the corner. Her grandmother watched her with those clear, steady eyes. Eleanor Davis had built her life on quiet determination, on the principle that a single soul could carry more weight than an army of critics. Tonight, she reminded Monique that the real fight was just beginning. Monique forced a small nod and took another sip. After a moment, she set the mug down. The lid rattled softly against the saucer. The truth was that even though Crestline Airways had collapsed in spectacular fashion, leaving ghost ships of planes on runways and thousands of stranded passengers, the underlying issues that allowed discrimination to thrive still existed. She thought of every child who had been pulled aside for looking out of place, every immigrant shaken under harsh lights, every weary traveler made to feel small. None of their stories ended with a boardroom implosion. That night, Monique drafted her next manifesto. She wrote with the same quiet confidence that had guided her call at Gate 42. 10 pages of hand-scrawled ideas, federal legislation for passenger advocacy offices, a national registry of discrimination complaints against carriers, mandatory cultural empathy modules and flight training, and an independent watchdog with subpoena power. She imagined a world where no one could hide behind a uniform and a clipboard to shame another human being. The following morning, she rose at dawn, determined to act on those ideas. Eleanor arranged meetings with sympathetic congresspeople. Monique sat across from representatives in a small wood-paneled office less than a mile from the Capitol dome. She spoke plainly about her experience. She described the weight of Colleen Briggs's clipped words, the hum of engines that had felt like a lullaby before shattering into chaos, the sound of laughter that wasn't meant for her ears. She didn't tear up, she didn't raise her voice, she simply told the truth. By lunchtime, draft legislation was circulating among staffers. Words like passenger dignity and zero tolerance for racial profiling glowed on the pages. Monique watched from the gallery as seasoned politicians nodded in agreement. When Senator Maria Thompson rose to sponsor the bill, she compared Monique's quiet strength to the suffragettes who had marched courageously decades before. Back in the city's heart, Crestline's former headquarters lay silent, its windows dark, its lobby empty. Bulldozers stood ready to remove the airline's corporate signage, media trucks lined the streets, operators readying satellite links for live coverage. Once proud executives like Russell Denton were now fighting subpoenas and depositions. Monica Reyes faced professional disbarment for knowingly suppressing complaints. Garrett Moore's phone never stopped ringing with offers for interviews and lawsuits from former staff members. Leonard Walsh had vanished into the financial ether, his reputation as tainted as his company's. But for all the institutional collapse, Monique knew the real work was transforming minds. She returned to her high school the next week and walked through the halls to deliver a speech at the auditorium. Under bright stage lights, she faced an audience of 400 peers, teachers, and townspeople. She described the ripple effect that one person's courage could ignite, how a single phone call had toppled an empire built on indifference. "I wasn't special," she told them. "I was just in the right place at the right time, and I chose to speak up." She paused, her gaze sweeping the rows. "You all have that power too. When you see injustice, even the smallest voice can shake the world." The auditorium erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. Students rushed the stage, begging for selfies, for advice, for stories. Monique stayed late into the evening answering questions about legal strategy, community activism, and how to stand firm when people tell you to be quiet. She promised to help each of them find their voice. That night, she returned home to Eleanor's cozy kitchen. They ate simple chicken soup and homemade cornbread. Monique described the day's highs and lows. Eleanor listened and nodded with pride. "You're changing lives," she said quietly. "Never doubt that." In the weeks that followed, the passenger advocacy bill gained co-sponsors at a record pace. Labor unions, civil rights organizations, and travel associations held joint press conferences, pledging support. Airlines across the country quietly updated their policies to avoid federal scrutiny. Websites added easy-to-find corners where travelers could file complaints directly with oversight bodies. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Meanwhile, Colleen Briggs's story took another unexpected turn. The fallen flight attendant appeared on a popular daytime talk show alongside Monique. With tears in her eyes, Colleen admitted that she had been under immense pressure to enforce first-class boundaries, that she had feared discipline if she showed leniency. She spoke of sleepless nights, of shame for her actions, and of the relief she felt when Monique forgave her publicly at the gala. The moment was raw and honest. Colleen and Monique hugged on live television, and hundreds of thousands of viewers watched as conflict gave way to compassion. It was a lesson in redemption and showed that justice can be compassionate and healing. Public opinion shifted further. News anchors began highlighting stories of everyday heroes who defied prejudice in airports, stadiums, and city buses. A journalist compiled a year-long series on unreported discrimination incidents, spurring further reforms in hospitality, retail, and public services. Monique's phone, which had once rung only with crisis news, now buzzed with invitations, keynote speeches, advisory roles, fellowship offers. One particularly emotional letter arrived from a mother in Phoenix. Her teenage son had been humiliated by security for looking too suspicious. The boy's school performance had plummeted, and he'd grown withdrawn. After reading about Monique's activism, the mother called a local news station, then met with airport officials to demand change. The local airport authority launched a sensitivity training program. The boy's grades recovered. The mother wrote that her son was beginning to smile again. Monique cried when she read that letter. It reminded her why she fought. It reminded her that behind every policy document and television segment was a real person whose self-worth hung in the balance. As autumn settled over the city, Monique's senior year kicked into high gear. She balanced homework with her growing activism, attended classes in English and history, and practiced French with a tutor. At night, she and Eleanor sat by the fire and discussed world events, conflicts in distant countries, refugee crises, economic inequality. Monique sometimes felt overwhelmed, but Eleanor always reminded her to care deeply while guarding her own heart. Academic awards started to line Monique's bedroom shelves. She received a scholarship offer from a prestigious social justice program at a top university, yet the choice weighed on her. Did she pursue activism full-time or earn credentials first? She talked it through with Eleanor over mugs of cocoa. In the end, she applied to schools that offered both strong academic support and hands-on advocacy opportunities. Graduation day arrived in June under a cloudless sky. Monique wore a simple cap and gown, her tassel dangling just 3 inches to the right. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, the principal announced her as valedictorian and recognized her national impact for passenger rights. The auditorium erupted in cheers as Monique delivered her final high school speech. "Never underestimate the power of one quiet voice," she told her classmates. "Life will ask you to stay silent in the face of injustice. When that moment comes, remember Gate 42. Remember that respect isn't optional. It's the birthright of every human being." After the ceremony, friends and family showered her with hugs. Reporters jostled for questions. Teachers thanked her for inspiring a generation. Yet despite the celebration, Monique found a quiet spot in the courtyard. She sat beneath a magnolia tree and closed her eyes, letting the breeze carry the scent of blossoms and summer promise. Eleanor joined her with 2 glasses of lemonade. They clinked cups softly. "To standing tall," Eleanor said. Monique smiled through tears and nodded. The summer that followed was a whirlwind of travel and speaking engagements. Monique spoke at conferences in New York and Los Angeles, sat on panels in Washington, D.C., and helped launch community training workshops across the country. She saw countless airports, big and small, and met people from every walk of life. Some told her they'd never flown again, yet had found the courage to return because they balanced the new era of dignity she championed. Back home in her small town, old friends remained her anchor. They went to the county fair together, rode the Ferris wheel at twilight, and laughed over cotton candy under strings of lights. Monique never forgot to be a teenager. She still painted watercolors and learned new guitar chords. She still called her closest friends to talk about crushes and summer plans. But nothing could erase the impact of her call at Gate 42. It had turned the tide of an industry and reminded a nation that fairness and respect were not outdated ideals, but necessities. And Monique Davis had shown them that power need not roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's found in a flip phone held steady, in a quiet voice standing firm when everyone else turns away. As another autumn approached, Monique prepared to leave for college. She packed her bag with textbooks, notebooks, and that old guitar. Eleanor pressed a small journal into her hands. "For your thoughts," she said. Monique nodded. She promised to fill its pages with hopes and plans for the next chapter, advocating for human rights beyond aviation, maybe even international law one day. On her last morning at home, Monique and Eleanor walked to Gate 42, now a simple waiting area like any other, stripped of its fame and infamy. They stood together by the rope line, watching planes taxi by, the engines whispering of distant horizons. Monique laid a single white rose on the ground where she once stood alone. "This place changed me," she whispered. Eleanor slipped her arm through Monique's. "And you changed the world," she replied. They walked away hand in hand, the sun warm on their backs, ready for whatever came next. Monique Davis sat back in the soft leather chair as Eleanor's words settled around her. The scope of what she had unleashed was greater than she could have imagined, reaching deeper than any single lawsuit or headline. Across the country, CEOs in glass towers called emergency strategy meetings. Public figures issued hollow apologies that rang untrue. Major shareholders demanded immediate audits. Men like Russell Denton, once so confident in their power, now whispered anxiously behind closed doors, fearing that the same truth that felled Crestline Airways would topple them next. Outside the quiet office tower, the city pulsed with restless energy. Rush hour had lost its rhythm. Bus drivers kept doors open for frantic passengers checking breaking news alerts. Store clerks paused mid-scan to read notifications on their smartphones. In every corner of town, people wondered which company would crumble under the weight of its own hidden crimes. Monique watched from the tinted window as headlights formed a river of white and red. Each light a reminder that this moment was reshaping lives everywhere. Inside the suite's smaller lounge, heavy curtains muffled the clamor beyond. A tray of sandwiches and fruit sat untouched on the coffee table, the scent of cold turkey wafting in the lamplight. Victor Hale entered silently, tablet in hand. He handed it to Eleanor, who scrolled through settlement offers from Crestline executives. Their tone was clinical. Compensation packages, non-disclosure clauses, promises to make amends without addressing the heart of the matter. Monique's jaw tightened as she saw how they tried to bury every voice with a check. Eleanor set the tablet aside, her expression unreadable. "They're offering hush agreements," she said, voice low. "They want to close mouths before the courts pry them open." Monique nodded. It was cruel, a final act of power to muzzle the very people the company had mistreated. Flight attendants who had lent blankets and comfort now faced buyouts. IT staff who documented complaint emails were offered severance. The system she had challenged now fought back with its oldest tactic: silence in exchange for money. Her grandmother leaned forward. "You have a choice. You can let the lawsuits and investigations run their course, or you can push this even further." Monique closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the exhaustion in her bones. Her body ached, her mind felt frayed. Turning the fight over to lawyers would ease her burden. She could retreat into normal life, where late-night study sessions and campus friendships awaited, but deep down, she knew the system hadn't earned her trust. She opened her eyes and met Eleanor's gaze. "I'm not done yet," she said, voice steady. Eleanor's rare, proud smile softened the worry lines on her face. Victor stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the table. "We prepared this earlier," he explained. "It's a public statement. Your statement. No edits, no corporate spin." Monique reached for the folder. Inside were simple, unvarnished words. The truth of what happened, why it mattered, and a demand that respect become more than a slogan. By the stroke of midnight, Monique Davis released her statement online. At 11:58 p.m., major news sites posted it on their homepages. By 12:30 IMN, social media feeds across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram flooded with her name. 37 countries began trending Monique Davis statement. By 2 a.m., several airlines announced immediate internal reviews of customer service practices. News anchors read her words on live television, their voices carrying the weight of a generation tired of empty apologies. Monique sat by the wide window as the city refused to sleep. Screens in bars, hotel lobbies, and hospital waiting rooms replayed her statement over and over. Families gathered around tablet screens at kitchen counters. Workers on late-night shifts scrolled through their phones, drawn into a conversation they could no longer ignore. Across suburban towns and inner-city streets, people nodded in solidarity, feeling the tremor of change coursing through their community. As dawn approached, traffic moved more deliberately through the streets, as if the city itself understood it was entering a new day. Victor led Monique through an underground garage to a sleek black sedan. They drove toward a modest brick building tucked between high rises. A brass plaque read Office of Public Accountability. The structure was unassuming, but inside, photos of teachers, nurses, bus drivers, and warehouse workers lined the hallways. Ordinary people honored for refusing to stay silent. In the main hall, reporters, activists, and community leaders rose as Monique entered. There were no banners, no floodlights, just a simple wooden podium and a single microphone. Monique approached with quiet confidence, her heart beating firmly in her chest. She placed her hands on the podium and looked out at the expectant faces. When she spoke, her voice was clear and unwavering. "I didn't ask for this to happen," she began. "I didn't wake up one day wanting to bring down a company. All I wanted was to be treated like I mattered." Her words rippled through the room. Cameras recorded every syllable. There was no anger in her tone, only the power of honest conviction. The truth was always there, people just didn't want to see it. Monique returned home to Eleanor's house just as the sun broke across the horizon. They sat on the porch, sipping hot tea as birds sang in the magnolia trees. The world had shifted overnight. It wasn't perfect yet. There were still board meetings and legal battles ahead. But for the first time, she felt a sense of real hope. Her grandmother squeezed her hand. "You changed the conversation," Eleanor said. "Now you'll change the solution." Monique smiled, gazing at the morning light. She understood that each day would bring new challenges, but she knew that hope, real and untamed, had been born not from what was given, but from what she had taken back. And as the city woke to a different world, one where every voice could echo across the halls of power, Monique Davis felt ready. She had stood. The walls had cracked. Now it was time to build something better, on the foundation of respect that no amount of hush money could ever bury. That night, Monique returned to Eleanor Davis's home, the farmhouse she had come to think of as her true sanctuary. The front porch light glowed soft and warm against the darkening sky. As she climbed the steps, she felt every ounce of exhaustion settle into her bones. Inside, Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair, knitting needles clicking like a heartbeat. When Monique entered, her grandmother's sharp eyes softened. Eleanor didn't need to ask how it went. She simply patted the cushion beside her, an invitation to sit and be heard without interruption. The next morning, Monique faced a fresh wave of challenges. Reporters cornered her outside a community center, pressing microphones toward her face. "How do you respond to Sinclair's plan to sue whistleblowers for defamation?" one asked. Monique paused, then replied with calm clarity, "You can't silence truth with threats." Her words cut through the din, and cameras captured the spark in her eyes. She refused to be intimidated by lawsuits or smear campaigns. Every legal threat they brandished only proved how far they would go to protect their empire of silence. That evening, under the amber glow of streetlights, Monique met with civil rights attorneys who volunteered their time. They drafted class action complaints against Crestline, not only for the incident at Gate 42, but for systemic violations, racial profiling, emotional distress, and willful concealment of complaints. When Monique learned that Sinclair's legal team threatened to countersue for tarnished brand reputation, she pressed her lips together. "Let them come," she said. "We'll show them whose voice truly matters." That Saturday, Monique returned to Gate 42, the place where her journey began. The terminal was quiet mid-morning, a handful of travelers milling about. She stood by the roped-off first-class line, her reflection in the polished floor tiles reminding her of that 15-year-old girl clutching her backpack in fear. She whispered a silent apology and a promise. "I will protect every child who stands where you stood." They slipped a small white rose between the rope and the metal pole, a symbol of purity and resilience. As she walked away, the airport's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the smell of coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. A uniformed attendant approached her with a tentative smile. "I'm sorry," she said softly, voice wavering. "You were right to call for help." Monique nodded, offering a gentle smile in return. "Thank you for saying that. This is just the beginning," she said, voice warm and sure. Respect can no longer be optional. Later that night, in Eleanor's farmhouse, Monique sat on the porch swing as fireflies danced around them. The cicadas droned softly, and the air was rich with the scent of honeysuckle. Eleanor joined her, rocking in her chair with a contented sigh. "You shattered the silence," she said proudly. "Now it's time to let the world rebuild on truth." Monique leaned back, watching the stars emerge one by one, each a promise of hope. The fight was far from over, but she carried a fierce light in her heart, one that no darkness could ever extinguish. Monique Davis settled into the empty rocking chair as the early sun painted the field gold. For a long moment, she and Eleanor just listened to the wind whisper through the tall grass. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice gentle but certain. "You know this fight doesn't end here." Monique nodded. She'd learned that injustice thrives wherever people stay quiet. Eleanor leaned forward, her cane resting against the chair. There will be other gatekeepers, other closed doors. Monique drew in a steady breath. I know, she said, but it has to start somewhere. Eleanor's proud smile held the weight of her own battles. Monique realized that day marked the beginning of a new road, one she would walk boldly. Inside the house, Victor prepared coffee. Monique watched steam curl from her mug, savoring its warmth. Messages still buzzed in her pocket, thanks from strangers, invitations to speak, even threats from those clinging to old power. She ignored them. Today was for remembering who she was before the headlines. Eleanor joined her on the porch, handing over a second mug. They sat in companionable silence, two generations bound by dignity and resolve. Monique lifted her cup in a quiet toast. To standing when it's easier to sit, she said softly. Eleanor nodded. That's all that ever really matters. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more inspiring tales.